Hey, thanks for stopping by, Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. As always, make sure you are subscribed, and there should be actually a little banner on my channel now where you can actually subscribe directly from my channel, and then hit the bell icon to get notifications so you can see all my really important content, because anything I say is incredibly important to me. But today I'm really excited to have the brains behind the Bella Dangelo Show, the Bella Dangelo Show on today. And Bella will admit that she's the funny and the one everybody wants to look at. Nobody wants to see Walter. They just like to hear what he has to say. So Walter Walter, describe what you do for Bella. Like, you're the straight guy, right? Like, you come in and Bella just like makes all her jokes about you, or
right. Yeah. So I guess the one word answer is producer. I produce the show. I do a lot of the technical stuff behind the scenes. And I try to keep us on track logistically during the course of the show itself. Yeah, I'm the straight man in the sense that Bella and Jay have a great banter that they have going back and forth with humor and talking about Bella's mom and, you know, anecdotes, stories of what happened during the week or throughout the day. And when it comes time for somebody to lay the smackdown on a hardcore topic like CRT, critical race theory, that's when they turn to me and I give them 2 minutes of, you know, just blazing rhetoric about philosophy and morality and whatnot. And then they laugh about it and kind of makes me feel bad.
So, well, you know, that's why you're the straight guy. So you are
Right.
You are the Bo Snerdley of Rush Limbaugh to Bella Dangelo.
Much more vocal than Bo.
Vocal than Bo. Okay,
but yes, that's I'll take that.
That's a good weight to bear. So Walter has already mentioned that critical race theory, and as everybody who watches my channel, all tens and tens of them, knows, we do draw a distinction between critical race theory and all the other critical theories that are out there, and they're all inextricably linked. I mean, there's critical gender theory, critical sexual theory, there's just tons of them, and they're all part and parcel of the same mentality, the same Marxist ideological position. They're all interlinked with intersectionality, and they all bring their points. But the end goal of critical theory, and in particular critical race theory, as we're seeing it advanced in society today, is a complete and fundamental change in how Americans think and interact. And Walter is versed in this, and I want people to hear this from a local guy, because don't get me wrong, Walter's probably heard of James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and those guys. You can hear it from these ivory tower and they're down to earth, but they're ivory tower intellectuals. And Walter's just kind of local Minnesota guy. He's a local Minnesota guy.
I'm a wooden tower intellectual.
He's a Minnesota nice intellectual. But there again, he brings a sharpness to it that people need to hear. So it's not just me saying it all the time, because that's the problem. It's just, I feel like a broken record when I talk about these things and what they look like. And so, Walter, give us a little bit of an introduction on how you got interested in critical race theory, when that happened, and what your first thoughts of it were when you started to see it rise its head, because it just didn't show up in 2021 or 2020. It's been around for a while.
Like so many things, when you talk about critical race theory and CRT, it's hard to pick a point at which to begin. I think you have to go to the core concept of race. And as somebody who is both the product of and a partner in interracial marriage, race is something that obviously has been a key component of my, I hate to use the word identity, but it has been a key component of my identity and a key component of my experience while I've been growing up and while I've proceeded through adulthood and gotten married and had kids of my own. What I noticed because I used to be much more libertarian in the sense that the big L Libertarian Party is. So when I would talk about issues of race or issues of criminal justice and the potential for criminal justice reforms, and I've even advocated for reforms here and there, I was operating under an understanding of race and racism and equality and equity and inclusion and tolerance. I was operating under definitions of all those terms that you would probably think of when those terms first come to mind. What it means to be tolerant, what it means to be inclusive, what it means to not be racist or to recognize racism when you see it. At some point in the discourse, as I was negotiating my way through being a professional political commentator and engaged in the discourse as a candidate for local office, at some point it became very obvious that the increasingly dominant definitions of these words are entirely different from the ones that I grew up knowing.
Right. You know, I'm really glad that you brought that up. So I'm an interrupter, by the way. So
no, that's good.
What Walter's talking about here, and he'll recognize this term, is what Walter's talking about is deconstructionism. And philosophically, deconstructionism, okay, for all of my Minnesota friends like Ross and Christy who own a construction company, deconstructionism isn't you tearing the road down. Okay, I just want to make sure everybody knows that. Deconstructionism is tearing down, but what it is philosophically is it's going to part and parcel to etymological sources like words. And it's taking that word apart, taking away its meaning, what that word has always meant, coming back in underneath that word and that structure, and reasserting new definitions of that word. And we can see that played out really well in a couple of places within culture in the American psyche today. One of those is the word gay. That word has been completely deconstructed and then and rebuilt to mean something completely different than what it meant even in 1950 and 1960.
Right.
And another place that we see this, and this is predominantly in the church, in Walter and I share a like conservative Christian faith. I would say that's a pretty safe bet. You know, he'll correct me when I'm wrong because I've watched him do it with Bella and Jay. So, but a place where we see this within Christianity is in two words, actually. One is the word love.
Yep.
Love within Christianity has been deconstructed and refabricated into something completely different than what the Bible defines it as, considering the Bible has no less than, in Greek alone, has no less than 5 different words for the word love. And 2, it's the word nice, not out of the Bible, but how the church approaches the word nice, because the church always says, oh, you need to be nice like Jesus. Well, nice doesn't mean today, because of deconstructionism and changing standards. Nice doesn't mean today what it meant 60 years ago. And even further back, nice, and I wrote an essay on this, is nice actually meant to be worthless and not good for anything. And so we've turned it into something different. And so you see this play out. And so what Walter's talking about with these changing terms is deconstructionism. And these are important things for people to understand as you approach the topic that Walter is going to be talking about as he launches more into critical race theory in particular. So what are some of the changes that you started to see, Walt?
Well, I would add, before we move forward from that, I would add to that the purpose behind the deconstruction, what they are doing is bamboozling you. It's obfuscation. Yes. What they're trying to do is they're trying to borrow and repurpose your emotional reaction to the original meaning of the word. With the word racism in particular, we can see this, right? When somebody calls you a racist, they are counting on you to have a reaction to that word that is in response to the old definition, right? Yeah. So you are bringing your concept of what a racist is to that interaction and then proceeding accordingly. They want you to do that, but they want to be actually talking about something else entirely. And so it's this bait and switch where they're trying to conjure an emotional response to their new novel concept that they've just come up with, and then pretend as though that's the way we've always felt about their new novel concept.
Right.
When in point of fact, it's an invasion of the body snatchers conceptually, where they've taken something that we all know and they've bored it out and invaded its husk and are puppeting it around like a sock puppet rhetorically, and then expecting you to just go along with that and accept the new premise which they've snuck in under the door.
Right. And that's there again, people have to understand, like, I can guarantee you're going to hear Walter and I talk in some way, shape, or form about Marxism, Gramscian theory, and things like that throughout the course of this conversation. I don't care how long it lasts. It could be another 15 minutes, and you'll probably hear Gramsci like 75 times. So, but what you have to understand is this is calculated. This is calculated. None of this is happening by an accident. It may feel brand new to everybody, but this has been very much part and parcel of where they wanted us to be. And this even predates guys like Gramsci. This is Hegelian. Boy, try saying that word when you've been thinking all day. But it also has its roots in some of the work of guys like John Dewey, who we call the father of modern American education. It was all about subterfuge. It was all about changing out the way you think without you even knowing that we're changing the way that you think. And we see that played out in the construct, the societal construct of the nuclear family. Not until some of these things started to happen years ago. So critical theory, critical race theory especially, this isn't just like this thing that they started teaching in 2010. This has been around for a while, and they started it by doing all this different types of deconstructionism, and even the idea of a nuclear family of a dad, a mom, and 2 kids living in a house in a suburb is normative. It's not. That's forced. That was forced onto culture. They forced that into culture to say, oh, you should have this, and it completely broke down things like the Black family structure, and Hispanic family structures, and Italian family structures, and whatnot, so that now everybody is divided, and you have to see these things happening. And when you look back in history, you could see these clear delineations of where this stuff is taking place, and it's all inextricably linked through people like Dewey and Gramsci and Alinsky and his acolytes as they came on. So go ahead, Will, go with more. I could do this all night with you. So
your follow-up question was, what other changes have I seen? And I would say that the things that I have seen change, other than the definitions of words, are the sensibility of our liberal politics. And by liberal, I'm trying to evoke like classical liberalism, right?
Classical liberalism, yep.
There was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, I'm old enough to remember it, so are you, where it went without saying that we had certain objectives as a society. Among those were things like equal treatment under the law, that justice is blind, right? That we judge a case on its merits, we judge it on the facts, we try to be objective, we take things like race, economic status, gender out of it, and just view it as individuals interacting with individuals, and on an objective level, what crime was committed here, and how do we know factually that it was committed. What has changed, and that's a criminal justice application of what I'm talking about. Another application of it would be in education, the idea of equity. This word equity has been introduced as a contrast to and an opponent of equality.
Yep.
They have moved past equality to equity, which is something totally different. And they will be the first to tell you that it is something totally different than equality. What equity says is we're going to end up on the back end, we're going to end up with the same outcomes. Whereas equality says on the front end, you're going to have equal access. And then whatever happens, happens. We all start at the same starting line. We all drive from the same tee. And whatever the score ends up being at the end of the game, that's your score, and it is what it is. Yeah. You're going to achieve or you won't, and you'll be along that spectrum, and good for you if you do, and if you don't, then that's life.
And the responsibility is yours, no matter what the outcome is. Yeah.
Correct.
Exactly.
And equity inverts all of that. Equity says, no, at the end of the game, we are all going to have scored 60. 60 on the round, all of us. And whatever it takes, you can cut holes out of there for certain people. You can move tees to, halfway down a par 5, whatever you have to do for the individual person.
For those people who watch my channel, that's a golf reference. I've just exhausted my entire repertoire of golf lingo. So go ahead.
As I was crafting the golf analogy in my head, I was thinking to myself, I don't even play golf. I don't know why I chose a golf analogy, but the golf analogy is where we went. The point is that you can imagine how absurd that would be, right? If you started with the goal of everybody's going to have the same score at the end of this round. Well, first of all, why even play? Why even watch? Who's interested in watching that? Like, what is it that you're watching for? You sit down to watch a sporting event. What you're watching for is who's going to win, and how are they going to do that?
Now, full stop. And I want people to think about what Walter just said, because he brought in the sports stuff. So, like, I don't know why. He's clearly not watched much of my commentary. No, I'm kidding. I want you guys to think back now over the last 15 to 20 years to the sport world, down at the pee-wee level and the junior high level and even senior level, where you're talking intramural sports. Everybody gets a participation ribbon. We don't keep score. There's no winners or there's no losers. Do you hear this? They have been teaching you equity for a very long time,
right? For
a very, very long time. Everybody gets to play, all of that. Because at the end, what we want is that mutual outcome. And so Walter used the phrase, or the word or the concept of everybody's going to have a 60. So that means you may have a potential to have 120. And so the guy who comes in and scores a 120 will have 60 points shaved off of his score to hand it out to other people to bring them up to 60. So think about that. That's what this looks like. Now imagine going in and taking the ACT or the SAT and having points shaved off your test to give to somebody else, so that based on nothing more than the fact that you are the non-approved oppressed class of the time period. Go ahead, Walt.
Well, and the spiritual effect of this is the destruction of self-esteem and aspiration. You have nothing to be proud of if you succeed.
Yep.
In fact, you should be ashamed. How dare you? Check your privilege. You shouldn't aspire to do better than others, because if you're doing better than others, then you've cheated them in some way. You must have an advantage that needs to be negated through some sort of anti-racist work, or whatever zone of critical theory we find ourselves in the given moment. And so the impact of this culturally, spiritually, morally is degradation, it's corruption, it's death. In fact, the most equitable place that exists on earth is the graveyard. That's where the goals of equity have finally and forever been achieved. And it's the only place where they have finally and ever been achieved. And it is it is the ultimate methodology by which they will ultimately and finally be achieved. Death. That's their prescription on a long enough timeline. It's just a question of, pick your poison. How are we going to get there? Is it
Right.
going to be by handicapping us economically? Is it going to be by undermining us spiritually? Is it going to be by inverting our morality? But at the end of the day, the application of on all of these fronts is getting you to stop living, getting you to stop moving forward, aspiring, growing, being, becoming, because you might pass somebody else. And if you do, it's somehow offensive to them that you succeed. It used to be that you see a guy drive by in a nice car, and the sentiment was, man, wow, I hope I have one of those someday. Now it's that, what did he do to me to get that? What that should be mine, even though I haven't earned it. It should be mine because he shouldn't have more than I have. That's
Who did
the
he
mentality.
hold down?
Who did he hold down to get that? Exactly.
It's funny that you tell that in that analogy, or bring that analogy into it, because I think it was well, you know who Joe Souchere is, Garage Logic. Yeah, Joe Souchere talks about watching an interview with Bono from U2, and he was on, I think it was Jay Leno, and Bono was talking about how he craves to have the American ideal of seeing the mansion on the hill, and aspiring to have that mansion, because where he comes from, and for those of you that don't know, Bono is from Ireland, and he said in Ireland, so like in the United States, I look around and I see people see a mansion on the hill and go, oh, someday I'm going to have a mansion like that. I'm going to have that. I'm going to have that car. I'm going to have that mansion. I'm going to have that nice suit or whatever it is. He says in Ireland, what we see is the guy who lives in the mansion on the hill, and the first thing we say is, I'm going to get that bastard.
Right.
which is exactly where we are now in the United States.
Yeah.
We don't crave the mansion. We crave beating the living crap out of the guy who has the mansion, and then burning the mansion down so no one else can have it.
And it's important to recognize that quality of what we're talking about. We have to focus on the concept of death, not only because that's the ultimate end of where all of this leads, in every sense of the term, that's where it ends. But we also need to think about it because when you realize that this is the worldview of death, this is the ideology of death, then you stop expecting its advocates to care about their own lives. See, one of the biggest mistakes that we make in our advocacy as conservatives, as I don't even want to say conservatives, because this is not, I don't believe that this is a conservative thing. This is a normal, living, breathing, aspirational American thing.
Yep.
When we try to argue against them or convince them with appeals to value, we say, hey, your kids would get a better education if you dispensed with this equity nonsense and focused on individual achievement and objective measurements and value. Well, they don't want that, because the ultimate goal, the goal is not to obtain the value, the mansion, the car. The goal is to get the bastard, you. Yep. That's the goal. The goal is to tear you down. And they don't care whether or not they're going to end up dead alongside you, because they don't
want you dead.
Yeah, they don't value their life. Yeah. They just want to destroy yours.
And the reality of this is too, and people have to understand that, like, this is Nietzschean philosophy in its core. It's fatalism. It is absolutely fatalism. And so if you're watching these things play out, when you see people go in, I'm going to tread very lightly here because I am a pasty white guy from Southeast Minnesota. So when you watch North Minneapolis or any part of Minneapolis after a law enforcement involved interaction that has resulted in the death of a black man, and you watch them burn down their own neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah.
It's the fatalism, because they've been taught none of it matters.
That's right.
That's right. And that's not because they're black or Hispanic or Asian or whatever it is. It's because the people that are out there helping them are oftentimes white intellectual elites who are leftist, because they've all been taught Equity and misery, burn it down. Burn it down, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
TC,
sorry, Walt, I went off on a tear.
I am so glad that you took it there and pointed that out, because you're right. You know,
I don't want to be right.
No, but I'm going to use another cultural analogy that you won't be able to relate to. But people often talk about the hip hop culture. And
hey, look at you see what I'm rocking?
No,
my hat, man.
Oh, okay. All right. I got you. Your skull cap. All right. Yep. Okay. Well, maybe you could hang in North Minneapolis. I don't know. But,
no. If I'm out there with Reverend Christopher.
We have forever we've heard critiques of hip hop culture and popular Black culture, the degradation of women, the glorification of violence.
Yep.
And often that conversation is characterized by a critique of Black people. You know, you'll have some conservative, some white conservative who will say, well, you know, these Black people are putting out this music, these movies, this culture. And
the amorphous Black culture, not like what does that even mean?
Well, and there's certainly, we are all, as you pointed out earlier, we are all individually responsible for the actions that we take.
Mm-hmm.
However, stop to think about, is it Black people that have owned all of the record labels and music studios and radio stations and movie studios? Have Black people been in charge of Hollywood all this time? Have they been in charge of Wall Street? Have they been running the show financially? No, it has not been Black people doing all of that predominantly. Right. And so it leads you down a path where you very quickly realize, gee, there are people, white people, as you pointed out, white lefties, white liberals, who have been conscientiously making choices about what type of culture to emphasize and what type of culture to minimize. As you pointed out earlier, there is a past in the Black experience, the Black culture, the Black family, that looks very different from what we know today.
Yep, absolutely.
And it has been conscientiously degraded and assaulted and torn down in no small part by the cultural choices and the cultural influence of white liberals. And you have to ask yourself, why?
Right.
What is the motivation for that?
Why do we have, and I'm going to just, like, Walter's smarter than I am, but I'm going to just insist that from now on, whenever we're talking, you can't say liberals anymore. You have to say leftist.
Gotcha. Sure. No, I can conform with that.
What we have to do is we have to understand is that you know, so here's an example. I get really tired of going, well, the Republicans are the ones that freed the slaves, and the Democrats were the KKK. Right. And then you hear the argument, well, they switched at some point. Like, the people that were once Democrats were actually are now Republicans, and the people that were Republicans are now Democrats. I'm like, no, I don't want to hear that. The Republicans are the Republicans, the grand old party, and the Democrats were the Democrats. And yeah, they all had some things, but this idea that somehow the appeal to these minority communities, if you want to use that reference, is like, oh, vote for the Republicans, come over to our side because we've actually been the ones that have done the most for you. It doesn't work. No. Because the Democrats have been doing that for years, going, look at everything that we've done for you. We've been on your side for as long as you can remember. And that doesn't work. Now, do they tend to capture a larger percentage of the minority votes, especially in the Black community? Sure. But what actually is happening, what's at the root of this, is, like the rest of us, certain segments of the culture, certain segments of the society are pawns in a game to them. And it's not a game for fun. It's gamemanship. It's a chess game that they're playing. And quite frankly, the left is very, very good at it right now, because they're combating what I refer to as reactionary conservatism, or Fox News conservatism. No offense, Bella. I know you like Fox News, but It's this idea that all my news, all the info that I get, I'm getting from talking heads on the one conservative news network. And so you're constantly reacting to all your outrage, just as much as the left has an outrage culture, the right has an outrage culture as well.
Yes.
And so what you're doing is you're all being used. You're all being used. Every single person, not all of us. I'm painting with a broad brush, but we're all being used. And they're pitting us against each other because there's this tactical goal that they have in mind. And if they can look at the minority communities, especially the Black community right now, in the amorphous sense, and say, "Oh, you poor oppressed people, look at what these conservative, rich, white people have done to you. You're never going to get ahead as long as any of them are in charge." It's the get that bastard mentality.
Yep. And
their game is on point because we're constantly responding. No, that's not how I feel. I'm not a racist. They constantly have us on the defensive instead of being out there on the offensive, talking about what we have to offer. Right. And that's exactly the core of the Marxist mentality behind critical race theory or all the other critical theories.
The motto of the modern pro-American, pro-life in every sense of the term, pro-liberty movement, our motto and our offer and our ask to those we're evangelizing is, come with me if you want to live. Mm-hmm. Come with me if you want to live.
Absolutely.
Now, some people will, because they don't want to live, they're not going to take that offer.
Right.
But there's a certain segment out there that doesn't even know that their life is at stake.
Yep.
Because they're bought into, well, as you put it, they're reactionary. So they're caught up in the reactionary game that's played between the two partisan sides. You know, I don't know how many Star Wars fans you have in your audience, but the way in which Senator Palpatine, the future emperor of the galaxy, plays the Republic against the separatists and actually controls both, and no matter which one of them wins, he becomes the emperor. That's the game. Like, George Lucas is onto something. He knows what he's talking about. That's what it is. Republican, Democrat fighting each other. In your eyes, one may be more virtuous than the other, but have you noticed that no matter which one of them win, you lose? That is by design. That's not an accident.
Ladies and gentlemen, Walter has just concluded the program for eternity with that comment. We're done. It's everything you need to know. I'm going to put this up, and I'm just going to leave it as the last video on the channel because it's so true. And if you don't believe me, I just want you to look at the last year and a half in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah,
absolutely. The last year and a half in the state of Minnesota, we couldn't get in, and I'm for gridlock and deadlock when it comes to legislatures and governors. Like, if we could get a Republican governor, a DFL controlled House, and a Republican controlled Senate, I would be okay with them never accomplishing anything ever again. The problem is, they all get into office and they become this giant amorphous blob that runs around your town absorbing everything. And you all lose because in the end the blob eats you. You just don't have it just eats you. It's just this giant sickness that spreads. And we don't get anything. We have people in the House and the Senate in the state of Minnesota whose whole goal when they get there is to reach across the aisle and work together. And people are like, okay, well, now you're not talking about critical theory, but this all plays in because they're all using it. They're all using it against you.
And I don't want to stray too far away from the topic for which we came together, but I will add this to what you're saying. And I wish I could properly cite the source of where I heard it. I believe it was Steve Deace's book, Rules for Patriots. Where he goes through and he's, maybe it was Truth Bombs. That's what it was. Truth Bombs by Steve Deace. He cites research, political research, that shows that in spite of the fact that people consistently say that they want people to quote unquote work across the aisle, what they actually mean is that they want to see their thing get done.
Right.
That's what they mean. Yep. They don't mean that they just want to see compromise for the sake of compromise, because that's stupid. And why would any thinking human being have that value? Even a non-thinking being wouldn't have that value. I just want to see two people compromise. That I'd be really excited by that. No, you want to see specific things. You want to see the trains run on time. You want to see your road redone or paved or the potholes filled. You want to see those things happen, and you want people to work together in order to achieve those ends. And so what Republicans have done, and establishment conservatives, is they've taken this idea of being moderate and being center right, and they've imposed upon it this application where all that means is getting along with the Democrats. Whatever they want to do, we should find a way to get along with them, because then we can go back to our constituents and say, well, I stretched my hand across the aisle and I worked with the other side in order to get this new boondoggle bond project put up in our city. Applaud for me, you know. And then what happens is those of us who understand what's going on, we roll our eyes and stay away from the ballot box the next time around and let that guy lose. And then he turns around, instead of learning the real lesson from that, which is you need to deliver on the things that people actually want, he takes it as an affirmation that, oh, well, I guess I didn't compromise enough. I guess I wasn't moderate enough. I should have gotten more bonding projects and done more borrowing and spent more money, and then maybe more people would like me and I could get reelected over this Democrat who's always going to offer more bribes than I will.
And this is where this ties into critical race theory, especially, is in the promises that they make. In the state of Minnesota, the DFL they're so good at this. We're going to come in. We're going to get you criminal justice reform. We're going to get you. We're going to get you restrictions put on how law enforcement interacts with you, because you're a victim. You're a victim. You're a victim. Right. You're a victim. You're a victim. Over and over. It doesn't matter what you do. You could be Winston Boogie Smith. You're a victim. And just another example of what we have to do. And all of this stuff all plays in. And ultimately what critical race theory does, and I think Walter will be able to elaborate on this better than I can. Critical race theory especially relies on the victimhood of the people it is trying to I don't want to say advance, because that's not the right word. They're really not trying to advance anybody. They're trying to pull everybody back. But what critical race theory does is it relies on the victim mentality of the people it's using to accomplish its ends, because it doesn't care about you, because in the end, all that matters is death.
So one of the key things you have to come to understand about critical race theory is that it is functionally a religion. It has its own creation myth. It has its own confessions. It has its own inquisition and ways of enforcing itself. It is a religion. And the clergy in this religion, which is to say, those who have the institutional authority to declare moral truth.
Yep. The
clergy in the religion of critical race theory is the victim. And the way in which you gain authority and status in the auspices of critical race theory is by presenting your victimology bona fides. That's what intersectionalism is all about. I'm a gay, black, Muslim cripple, right? Like, just stack it all up.
Boy, you hit them all right there. You got you got all the points. I think you got to add trans in there, and I think you might have hit the jackpot, bro.
I was trying not to throw in ones that would conflict with each other, but it's like, yeah, I'm all of these things. And because I can layer all of these victim experiences on top of one another,
Yep.
each of those comes with a certain amount of authoritative currency, moral credibility.
Yep.
They call it lived experience that you can then trade in for spotlight and most of all, deference. This is what they mean when they talk to white people and they say you need to check your privilege, you need to decenter yourself. What they're saying is you need to defer to the moral authority of the lived experience of this person over here. And that is in contrast to critical thinking and reason and discussion and equality. Because under critical thinking and reason and discussion and equality, the way that you and I interact is I present you with an argument, an observation, a premise, a theory, a hypothesis, supporting evidence, and then you can judge whether or not I'm right or wrong, and you can come back at me with challenges, the Socratic method. Well, what about this? What about that? And between the two of us, and through the consent of our interaction and our reliance upon reason and truth as a standard, we can discover what is real, discover what is true, and mutually benefit each other.
Right. And that's there again, and I've talked about this in a past video on the channel. Like, we've lost logic through all of this. We have lost logic, and like I'll be the first to admit I am not the most highly educated person that's ever had a YouTube channel, but the thing that I realized years ago was we have to engage logic. And logic's not just a part of your brain, and it's not a company that make Logitech. It's not a company that makes like technology for your computer. Logic is the reality of reasoning. You have to be able to do that, and you have to recognize when logical fallacies are being used, when logic's not being engaged. And as Walter was saying, we're not engaging in those ways because we're engaging in an almost completely emotional mindset. Everything's an emotional response now. And when you come in and you point out that calling that person a Nazi or calling that person a white, a KKK member is nothing but an emotional reaction, you get more emotional reaction. And there again, it's what they're counting on is the emotional baiting that's happening. Go ahead, Walt.
Well, while you were going through that, I pulled up this infographic that went viral a couple years back. It came from the Smithsonian Museum of African American History, I believe. And it made quite a ruckus because the institution tweeted this out, and it included the infographic here is what is whiteness, aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the United States. And here are some of the things that they included as aspects of quote unquote whiteness: rugged individualism, family structure, emphasis on scientific method, history, Protestant work ethic, religion, status, power, and authority, future orientation. A future orientation is what we were talking about earlier. Aspiration. Yep. I'm working towards a better future. Right. A sense of time, timeliness, the idea that I should be somewhere when I said I was going to be there. So they go down the list, and the part about emphasis on scientific method, the sub bullets are objective, rational, linear thinking. That's what they include under their definition of whiteness. And let's just pause for a moment to consider how racist that is. Because what they're saying is that to be non-white is to not be objective, to not be rational, to not be timely, to not have a work ethic, to not be an individualist, to not care about science. I mean, this is why when you were talking earlier about how there never was a grand switch between the Democrats and the Republicans, where all the racists went from the Democrats over to the GOP. That never happened. The Democrats stayed right where they were, and they upped their game. They came up with this stuff.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for saying that, because that just told people there wasn't a switch.
No,
it was just there was a bait and switch.
Yes. I mean, there was a switch. There was a constituent switch to the degree that the Democrats were successfully able to conjure narratives which won them African Americans as a constituency in the voting electorate. But there wasn't a moral or intellectual or ideological switch. Like, racism stayed in the Democratic Party. And they they discovered more sophisticated, more politically savvy ways to implement slavery, segregation, and the sense of racial superiority, which is, it comes out. They can't even hold themselves back. You talk about election integrity, and they're like, well, black people can't get a driver's license. Really? Wow. That's one of the most racist things I've ever heard come out of a person's mouth. But the DFL will talk about it yesterday.
Yeah. Or, like, if you're black and you don't vote for me, you ain't black.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Like, literally exactly how he said it. If you're black and you don't vote for me, you ain't black.
Yeah. And so, when we talk about what is CRT, which, we've been talking a lot about it, without necessarily getting to the core of it, but it is in large part, the rejection of objectivity, the rejection of all those things I listed: objectivity, reason, the scientific method, the concept of moral truth, future orientation, work ethic. It's a rejection of all those things and replacing it with something else. And
so let's look at it from this perspective. Not look at it from the perspective, but let's talk about it from the reality that, I want to be very careful how I say this.
I love it when people qualify with that, because it means it's going to be good.
Well, I hope so. It is completely antithetical. And this is to all the Christians out there. You cannot. I cannot judge your salvation. That is not my job. But you cannot be a Christian. Like a Romans 10 confessing homologeo, to agree with God and say the same things as God. You cannot be a Christian and embrace anything about critical theory, especially critical race theory, because it's an absolute rejection of everything that Christianity teaches.
Yes.
And that list that Walter read off, that all what qualifies as whiteness, that is not whiteness. That is not whiteness. If you think that being on time for your job is a white construct forced on black folk or Asian folk or Hispanic folk or Native folk or whatever, because that's their way of keeping you down, you have completely misunderstood the work ethic that comes out of the Near East. They were not white. they were Middle Eastern. And that was their work ethic. And that was embedded in Judeo-Christian values. So for you as a Christian to say, well, I embrace critical race, let's just do what the Southern Baptist Convention did when they brought in Resolution 9. And Walt, you and I talked about that briefly when I was on Bella's show there a few weeks ago. Resolution 9. Well, critical race theory is a tool to understand our culture so that we can better preach the gospel. I don't need critical race theory to preach the gospel, because here's what you need. And so I'm going to let somebody start playing the Hammond organ. So the gospel is every single one of us is a rotten person. Everything we do is sin. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. You're a rotten person and you need Christ. Period. and Christ came and did what you couldn't do, lived a perfect life in perfect obedience to the Father in a way that you can't do, and to his earthly adopted father and to his mother, and obeyed the authorities in a way that you can't, and then still went to the cross and died that substitutionary death at the end of his earthly life. Because you need a savior. And if you repent of your sin, not of your whiteness, not of being a poor black guy or a Hispanic guy or gal or gay or whatever it might be, but repent of your sin and turn to Christ for acceptance, you can be saved and be called a child of God. Everything about critical theory stands starkly opposed to that. And if you try to embrace that as a Christian, you have apostatized. You have apostatized because they're not compatible, because they demand that you look at people and you judge them and say, well, this person is more worthy because of their ethnicity. This person is more worthy because of their sexuality. This person is more worthy because of where they were born or their level of poverty. And Christianity doesn't do that. And the gospel doesn't allow for that. I'm sorry, I went off on a rant.
No, it's fantastic. And it sets me up for a great follow-up. Hopefully it'll be great.
It's better than anything else tonight.
So critical race theory is a practice, and that's a direct quote from its advocates. They say it's not a thing that is, it's a thing that you do. You do critical race theory. You engage in your anti-racism work. So critical race theory is the application of another gospel.
Yep.
And this other gospel is called social justice.
Yep.
And social justice is cultural Marxism. It's the application of Karl Marx philosophy to the culture.
Away from economics to culture.
And so let me try to put it in as simple terms as possible to prove to you what TC just said. You simply cannot be a Christian and an advocate or adherent or user of the tool of critical race theory. You can be a tool using critical race theory, but you cannot use the tool of critical race theory and call yourself a Christian. And I can prove it in less than a minute. Okay? Social justice is the opposite of the gospel that TC just preached. Social justice, cultural Marxism, Marxism itself, says from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. You need everything that God has to offer. He has the ability to give it to you and won't. That's the first plank of the gospel. The first plank of the gospel is God is God. You are you. You have sinned against him and deserve hell. That's the bad news, which is the context in which the good news makes any sense at all. And so you cannot say that on the one hand that I'm depraved and I need to repent of my sin and be forgiven and have my sins atoned for by the cross, by Christ on the cross, and be saved, and also say, I deserve what I need.
Right.
And it should be provided to me by someone who has the ability. Because if that's true, if Marx was correct, then God is a moral monster. If Marx was correct, then you have a grievance against the Almighty. And there actually is a person who holds that position and has been advocating for it since the beginning of time. His name is Satan. This is all old stuff dressed up in new clothes.
And for those of you right now who are thinking Nancy Pelosi, that's not what Walter's talking about.
No.
But that's where the church is at right now.
Yeah.
You have really two streams in the church. The PCA is in the same fight as the SBC. And culture, the Republicans are in the same fight as the SBC and the PCA. Right. The Democrats are just like, they're not even fighting. They're just like, yes, CRT, let's go with this. We're winning elections. Yeah. But the reality of this is that this is so permeated everything that we're doing. You can't escape it. You cannot escape it. Had a conversation with Carrie Smith from Unsafe Space podcast here a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the reality that, like, servers in restaurants, and we saw this played out in Broaders in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis. They now have an equity and benefits surcharge that they're putting on their bill because people don't tip people of color as well as they do white people. Like, I just want you to think about that. They literally accuse their customer base
of being racist.
And servers are now having to take implicit bias training so that they don't treat minority customers differently than they do white customers. This is it's impossible for you to escape this. It is everywhere in culture. And so what we have to do, and I think Walt would agree with me, is we have to verse ourselves in this. We have to know what it is. We have to know where it's coming from, and we have to know why, because it's fundamental. And that, you know, and in the pre-show conversation, Walt and I were talking about some of the work I'm doing with people who have started this grassroots organic organization of citizens for accountability in Owatonna, especially as it relates to the school district. And they're going to the school board meetings, and they're speaking out every time now for the last few meetings against critical theory, because they're hearing things that are making them go, what? I'm a racist? My kids are racist. My kids are racist simply because of who they are. Yeah. If people do not recognize that this is meant to divide and to destroy, we're in trouble. Yeah. We're in a lot of trouble.
Absolutely. And it's also meant to, so another way in which CRT and social justice are in anti-gospel, certainly another gospel, is that they do literally the opposite thing, right? Like the effect of each is opposite. The gospel forgives you and sanctifies you and justifies you and cleanses you and dresses you in white robes and earns you entry into heaven, where you can find total fulfillment in the role for which you were created, which is to glorify God. Okay. No big deal.
Let's just blow past that, Walt. That's no big deal.
Social justice and critical race theory condemns you. It is, again, who do we know who condemns people? Who do we know historically, biblically, who is known as the accuser? It accuses you of being guilty of sin.
Yep.
And being unable to ever escape from the wages of that sin, and having to submit yourself to this sort of self-flagellation where you're just beating yourself and tearing yourself down. Look at how the adherents, especially the white leftist adherents of critical race theory and social justice, you saw the effort there in my eyes. Like, don't say liberal, don't say. But read their tweets. Look at their social media posts. You know, listen to what they have to say.
Let me interrupt that thought. Look at the gal who on TikTok a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know if you've ever watched Brandon Tatum, but he just dressed this gal down. A white woman talking about her 5-year-old who was having a bad day, and how she had to tell her preteen child to not run to the white tears of a little white girl who's learning how to be manipulative. What? And there's another video, and if I'd been thinking, I would have had it up, but I didn't. I mean, I knew we were going to go the religious aspect by looking at CRT, but there's a video that's out there, and I talked about this with Veronica on my video about her talking, or in our conversation about her walking away from a cult and how she sees Christian cults and other cults just like adherence to social justice. You've heard it from Walter, and you've heard it from me in just this video. But there's a video out there, and I think it takes place in some place like New York, Central Park or whatever, and there's a black man standing up there, functioning as a high priest. He's surrounded by a sea of white folk, repeating to him this mantra of confession of their white sin. Like, if you like, I guarantee you Walt can probably find the video faster than I can. So maybe I'll get him to send it to me, and I'll try and include it in the link to this video when it goes up. But look it up. Look it up. And you tell me, as much as these people hate God, that they aren't building a religion. Because that's what it is. And at the crux of that religion, which is ironic as all get out to me, it's only kept alive and funded by the very people they're teaching to hate themselves for who they are.
Yeah.
Critical race theory would die a quick death on the vine if black people who said, I'm not going to be victimized anymore, and white folks said, I'm not confessing my sin to you anymore.
Just as Molech would find himself just an old curious stone idol that nobody cares about if people would stop throwing their children into his flame.
Right.
You know, it's a tale as old as time. Nothing has changed. There's nothing new under the sun, Solomon told us, and he knew what he was talking about. This is the same old interaction that is playing out under a new guise, and it is still, just as it was then, it is still about sacrifice to pagan idols, the worship of death, nihilism, and a rebellion, above all, a rebellion against God and his values and the glory of his name. That's what this is.
I'm getting goosebumps, Walter.
And it's going to take the good news is, though, so when you go and you read those stories, and I'm not as well versed as I should be on where the divisions are between all these stories, but I know there's a lot of them in ancient Israel, especially when you go through and you look at the kings and you know how there were good kings and bad kings, and there were times when the nation went into exile and then came back, and things were good and things were bad. There are certain patterns in there that you can recognize as repeating patterns.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is this: when the people repent, evil dies immediately. And it's like flipping. Now, in the other direction, it's the slow march through the institutions. You and I talked about this on Bella's show, right? With the it's been a while since we've evoked Gramsci, so I promised there would be at least 75 references, so you've got to up your game. Right. So historically, the corruption is always a slow drudge march through the institutions. It's always incremental. It's always the slippery slope. But when the reform happens, when the revival takes place, when God destroys his enemies, it is thunder and lightning and flood and ash from heaven and fire, and it consumes all who oppose him. And so that's the good news for us, is that when we repent, when we start to preach the real gospel, when we stand up and speak truth unapologetically and laugh in the face of our accusers, just like we get to laugh in the face of Satan, we can laugh in the face of our accusers for being silly and small and temporary and mortal and of the flesh, while we are children of the Most High. You know, as soon as we start to do that, they're going to have nothing. They got no power over that. None.
So are you familiar with, oh man, her name is, I'm no good with famous people. I was at a rally this last summer and somebody's like, so-and-so is here. And I'm like, yeah, who's that? And they're like, oh, she's a really good singer. And I'm like, Joy Villa. Is that right? She's like a Puerto Rican black gal. And she was at a rally. She was pro-Trump. And and she's singing she sings the national anthem. She gives this really rousing speech, and I was tasked with kind of escorting her to her Uber when it was time for her to leave. And as I'm walking her, I'm walking Bella, not Bella. I got Bella on the brain now. I'm walking Joy back to her Uber, and she would close your eyes with me. I want you to picture this scene. We're on the state capitol. The fence is up around the building, and I'm walking her towards away from the platform, and there's a group of Antifa and Black Lives Matter standing there chanting, and they start attacking her personally, not physically, personally, calling her a racist and a Nazi. I want you to let that is religion. That is a religion, and religion is not bad. The scriptures just describe this is pure and good religion. So for all of you, well, it's not a religion, it's the relationship. People out there, like, educate yourselves. But there is bad religion, and there is good and pure religion. And the bad religion is looking at a person like Joy, who's clearly a minority in the minority, and calling her a racist Nazi because she's not towing your line.
Yeah.
And this needs to be our response. And this is what Walter was saying.
Laugh
at them. Laugh at them.
Yes.
Just go. So what else you got? You got anything better, bro? Because I don't even care.
Well, and yes, I laugh at them. I also think it's appropriate and biblical to mock and ridicule them, to call them vipers.
You're not
whitewashed tombs.
Walter, you ready for this? I'm gonna bring it full circle. You're not being nice like Jesus.
Actually, I am being nice like Jesus. Like that's the whole point, is that's how Jesus was nice. You know what Jesus prioritized? His kingdom, the name of his Father, and when he was dealing with glory, and when he named, or when he dealt with other people, he cared about the disposition of their soul.
Yep.
And it's a similar dynamic to, I'm a father of 2 boys, and I was the son of a father, and fathers and sons are very familiar with the dynamic I'm about to describe. Your dad, if he's healthy, loves you.
Mm-hmm.
Was he always nice to you?
Mm-mm.
Did he always say comforting, nurturing things that made you feel good about yourself?
Mm.
No. And thank God for that.
Literally.
Because you know what your dad cared about more than your feelings in the here and now? He cared about your long-term, and if he was Christian, eternal well-being. That's what he cared about. And so when he sees you, the simple analogy is your kid's running out towards a busy street, and you scream at them, fire and brimstone, to stop before they run out there and get themselves killed. Is that because you're a cruel, overbearing parent? No, it's the opposite. It's because you love them and you care about them and you don't want to see them go the wrong way. And so in a similar sense, the application of that phenomenon in the public discourse is ridicule and mockery of people who are morally absurd, because they need to know that they're morally absurd. And how are they going to know if nobody tells them? Right? It's the same thing. It's the same principle as preaching the gospel. Like you have to stand on the truth, whatever the truth is, even if the truth is you're an absurd moral monster who deserves to be mocked and ridiculed. Because by standing on, because then you talked earlier about defensive versus offensive. Well, that's pretty offensive, taking that approach, and it forces them to have to respond, and they can only respond in one of 2 ways: by affirming your accusation, or by being affected and taking it to heart. And either of those are good results,
right? One, and I'm gonna piggyback off your analogy because I've heard somebody else talk about it. I don't know if you're familiar with who Paul Washer is.
Yeah.
But Paul Washer kind of used the same analogy. Like if you love your kid and they're going to run out in the middle of the street, you're going to yell at them, like, don't run in front of that semi. You're going to get hit by it.
Right.
But he also says, and at some point, like if your kid's about to run out into traffic, you grab them by the arm.
Right.
And you pull them back so hard. You don't care if it dislocates their shoulder or breaks their collarbone. You do what you need to do, because that temporary pain, that temporary suffering is actually not bad for them. It's good for them. And it hurts like all get out at that point in time, but it's good for them. And he uses that in the context of preaching the gospel. And I'm going to emphasize again too, the gospel is the answer to this problem.
Yes.
But sometimes we're going to engage in this from maybe a purely philosophical, not just a theological philosophical perspective, but just sometimes you're engaging from a philosophical perspective alone. And sometimes people need that kind of painful awakening of what you're saying and what you're doing is just absolutely ridiculous. They just have to, you have to recognize that what you're doing is you're damning yourself on a societal level, on a cultural level, like just removing, even if you want to, the religious aspect from it, you're damning yourself because you're making yourself subservient to a system that says you're subservient to a system. And you will have to spend the rest of your life in that victim culture, constantly victimizing yourself and victimizing other people. And you need that rude awakening in that slap across the face that says, no, snap out of it. This is ridiculous what you're doing. Walter, when you look at culture right now, and I tend to ask this question with anybody I have on, when we're talking about this particular topic, social justice, the cult of social justice, or wokeanity, I like to call it. Do you think that we are in the birthing pains aspect of it now? Obviously, it's been the culture's been pregnant with this for a while, right? But are we in the birthing pains aspect of it right now, or are we in the maybe seeing the death throes of it? Do you think they've gone too far, too fast, or are we in for more?
I'll combine your analogies. We are witnesses to a stillbirth. Yes, there's pains. Yes, there's upheaval. Yes, this is in some ways a beginning and a culmination and a fulfillment. But it is also going to trip over its own feet and face plant and crack its skull and die. Like this cannot go anywhere. That's the fundamental characteristic of death is inactivity. And that's what they're preaching. I mean, think about it. We're talking about, you want to go beyond critical race theory and just look at the leftist prescription for how we ought to live. You're talking about a worldview that thinks we shouldn't have energy. We should widely and prolifically tolerate relationships that can't produce children. We should poison ourselves mentally, spiritually, and physically with reckless abandon because it feels good. We shouldn't have to work. We should get things just magically, even though that's not how things are made. And we're seeing the attempt to apply these ideas in the real world. And it only takes one generation for all of that to faceplant, crack its skull, and die, because none of it works. And so, yes, we are seeing the birth of something, but it's going to come out the womb without a heartbeat. And there'll be some agitation as they try to revive it, but it's not going to revive because it inherently has no life. And God is good, to reappropriate that term. God is good, and he's going to prevail. And so I don't have, sometimes I must confess the sin of despair. There are definitely moments when you see a certain headline or you're scrolling through your news feed and you for a temporarily, hopefully, succumb to despair of and for me it turns into a prayer, from despair to prayer, where I'm typically praying not for God to fix things, but for him to, through judgment, destroy his enemies. And I'll take the hit, right? Like if my home, I'm not going to be Lot's wife. If I have to watch my home burn in order to destroy all this and start fresh for the glory of your name, I'm down. Let's do it, right? But ultimately, on a long enough timeline, we know who wins. We know there's victory. And we know these guys are beclowning themselves, and they're going to end up, they are already, in a sense, they are already in hell. They are citizens of hell. They are ambassadors of hell. And so because of that, we can pity them, and we can mock them and ridicule them. And we can also love them by calling them to repentance and praying that if it be God's will, and if he find glory through it, they can become the next Paul, right? That they can be regenerated and turn from one of the grossest evils into one of the greatest advocates for goodness and decency and moral truth.
You kind of sounding a little reformed there, Walter.
That's probably a label that fits. I am not very well read in all of the theological minutia, but to the extent.
Thanks for that little dig.
No. It's not a dig. It's to my shame, to my great shame. But my understanding of Reformed is that's the bill that fits for sure. So I certainly like the concept of reformation, which is to say the restoration of something to its original intent and form.
Semper referendum. So I'm going to throw a little curveball at you here, because you were just saying, well, it's a stillbirth. Okay, but what about Venezuela, Walter? What about Venezuela? Because not even 30 years ago, Walter, Venezuela was thriving. They had the strongest economy in Central America, and probably closest to rivaling, the United States. And we'll work towards closing on this, and then I'll ask you another question. But Venezuela's still kicking around out there.
Are they? I think I rest my case. 30 years ago.
I knew that was going to be a softball for you. So.
It doesn't work. The Ronald Reagan gets credited with defeating the evil empire, and there's a sense in which that's true. I mean, he had the moral courage to call it an evil empire, and that played a significant role in its final degradation. But the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner of the Soviet Union was Almighty God. I think. And when I say that, I don't mean to imply necessarily that there was a miraculous intervention into history to destroy the Soviet Union, although I don't withhold that possibility. What I mean is that God expresses his will. God expresses his will in at least two different ways. The way we tend to look for and falsely recognize is miraculous interventions in history. The common, everyday, most of the time way in which God expresses his will is the laws of nature.
Yep.
Reality. When you do the wrong thing, it doesn't work, and you suffer the consequences.
Right.
To a large extent, that's what divine judgment is. And again, if that can also include and be enhanced by intentional, miraculous intervention. But he doesn't have to do that, because the miraculous intervention was creation. Like he made the world to be what it is, and it works how it works.
Yep.
And so if you try to live your life out of sync with that reality, then his judgment is going to be allowing you to have what you chose. And again, how many times biblically have we seen that? Oh, you want a king? All right. It's not a good idea, but I'll give you one.
Well, John Calvin famously said two things. Well, he said a lot of things famously, but he said two things that I wish my audience would hear from me, and then I'm going to have Walter say some stuff. Calvin said that the human heart is a factory of idols, or an idol factory. Like, our hearts make idols, and what you see in critical theory, all the critical theories, but especially in critical race theory, is idolatry. It's idolatry. Yes. It's idolizing your victim status. It's idolizing your ethnicity. It's idolizing financial prosperity. It is. Your heart is producing that wickedness. But something else that Calvin said, and I think this is apropos of where we're at, is that when God wants to judge a nation, he grants them wicked rulers. And I'm kind of tired of the Christians saying, "Oh, well, you look at all this stuff happening, God is going to judge us." And then I point them to Romans 1, and I said, "No, like, when you look at Romans 1, when these things are happening, God has already judged the nation."
Right.
So when you look at all of this stuff happening here in the United States, and this is not doom and gloom, actually, this is a positive for Christians. And I'm going to speak specifically to my friends who are in these school board fights right now. We're going to their school districts and they're fighting. It'd be so easy to get in the doom and gloom aspect and go, "Oh, what are we going to do? We can't win this. The school board's got all the power and the state's backing them." Like, no. God is actually judging your community right now, and he's setting you up to come in and take over.
Right.
Your princes and princesses. If you're believers, and I don't care, like, we may have some doctrinal and theological issues, the minutia, as Walter likes to say. We may have some differences. But if you're truly a repentant child of God, and by child of God, I use that very specifically, because you're either a child of Satan or a child of God. We're not all God's children. You're one or the other. If you're truly a child of God, which means you have repented and placed your faith and trust in Christ alone for your salvation, and you are seeking to follow him as best as you can to be conformed into his image, you need to look at these fights as God is judging these people. He's judging them. And now it's your job to go in and rescue those that are being judged. Rescue the perishing. Rescue them. That's why these fights matter. That's why this is so important. Like, and I don't do a good job of representing it here on my channel all the time, even though I hail that this is predominantly coming from a Christian philosophical perspective. I don't represent it well constantly, but that's who we are. Like, if you're a Christian, and that doesn't mean I have room to team up with you if you're not a Christian. In some of these fights, I can team up next to you. But you have to understand, at the end of the day, we're going to have some very serious conversation about eternal matters at some point. Walter, as we get ready to close, not in the Baptist sense where we can then keep going for another 45 minutes, but as we get ready to close this, what sources would you point people to? Because we could have sat here and done this really deep dive into these threads of what actual, Kimberly Crenshaw and all of these other people and what's her name, who wrote White Fragility. And we could have really dove into this, but I think people needed to hear us talk about it and the reality of what it is, what it looks like, how we combat it, and the fact that it is actually a religion. Where would you point people, and what would you have them take away from our conversation tonight, or day or morning, whenever you happen to be watching this?
So I pulled up my Audible, and I'll give you a couple books.
I thought you were texting Bella saying, "Quick, rescue me."
And I can send these to you so that you can put them in whatever description you have. But Fault Lines, the first place I would point a Christian in particular, is Fault Lines by Voddie Baucham. This is a new book. It just came out.
I love Voddie.
It is fantastic. This will take you from having no idea what critical race theory is to being a subject matter expert. And it's concise, it's entertaining, it's engaging, it's a great book. You should definitely read it. after
And
that,
if you can't say amen, you gotta say ouch. That's Voddie Baucham, people, right there. It's
and then after that, I would go to the source. I would cleanse yourself, pray for
burn some
protection.
incense.
Yeah, right. And then go to the source and read Critical Race Theory in Introduction by Richard Delgado, and there's a couple other co-authors. And I did this in the other order. I read this first, and then I read Voddie Baucham's book. But what this does is it's from the horse's mouth. It's them telling you, the people who came up with critical race theory, them telling you what it is and how it works,
and what they're going to do to you.
yeah. And it's presented in this kind of like academic, with the dressing of academia. They try to present you with this information, and then they have like questions at the end of every chapter, like a quiz that they want you to go through, like a workbook.
Gee, that almost sounds like a Bible study.
There you go. And that's exactly what it is because as I said earlier, critical race theory is a religious practice.
Yeah. Critical theory is just absolutely a religion.
Yeah. And this goes into like the origins of critical theory as such. It started in the judiciary and the legal system. And so you get all the background. So if you could just read those two books alone, you'll be leaps and bounds ahead.
And once again, Walter will send those to me just so I can remember to put them into the description of the video so that you guys can look them up.
And then beyond that, I would say anything written or produced by Steve Deace, who you can find at the Blaze, is worth your time. I've read his books, Truth Bombs and Rules for Patriots, both of which are extremely insightful in terms of looking objectively at the world as we see it, and then deriving your sense of what's true from what you see rather than what you've been told. And those are because, ultimately this is a war. We're engaged in combat, spiritual combat, intellectual combat, cultural combat,
philosophical.
Yep. And the only way you win in a war is by having a lay of the land, knowing who your enemy is, what their capabilities are, how they're deployed, and when to strike. And the only way you're going to know that is by reading and reading and reading and watching videos. And
first of all, Walter, thank you and just incredibly for your time. I know you rushed home from work and to do this, and so you probably haven't ate yet. And I appreciate that. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the fact that we see big names. I'm going to throw them out there. We see the Candace Owens. We see the Brandon Tatums and others, the Tommy Sotomayars, who are out there they're big names and they're pushing against this stuff. And they're ending up in documentaries on Prime, like Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom 2 and things like that, because there's name calling. But what I appreciate about this, Walter, is you didn't come into this and say, listen to me because I'm a black guy. And I know it probably sounds funny to say that because I'm talking to a guy who most people look at and go, oh yeah, he's black, right? But what I appreciate about this is the reality of what you said is, I've lived this life. This is the life I've lived. And I'm telling you, this is dangerous. You didn't appeal to an authority that would have been basically, I'm black, so I have clout.
Right.
You just I've lived this life and I'm telling you this is dangerous, but it's not just dangerous because I'm a black guy saying it. It's dangerous because it's dangerous.
Right.
And that's so much of what people need to understand. Like, we can be having these conversations. Like, if we're not willing to have these conversations with each other when we agree, because we're afraid we're going to say something that's going to be off, then we're never going to learn. And if we're not learning, we're never going to be able to reach across the backyard fence to our neighbor who might be getting sucked into this, whose kids are getting sucked into this, whose school board is embracing this because they're being told if you don't, there's going to be trouble for you. We've got to have these conversations, and we have got to know how to combat this. And we have to know who our allies are. We hear that all the time now. Oh, you got to be an ally. You got to be an ally. You got to be an ally. Like a true ally, a person who in the Bible says, the paraphrase, the person who tells you the most truth is the person who loves you the most. And the kisses of an enemy are sweet, but the wounds of a friend are faithful. If somebody's coming up to you and they're saying, hey, look, what I'm about to tell you is going to cut you, you need to be listening to that person. And then you need to compare it to what you know and what you experience in reality. And it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. If somebody's telling you, I've got something to tell you and it's going to wound you, that person's your friend. Doesn't mean they're always right, but they're your friend. And that's why this stuff is so important. Look, to me, geopolitical United States isn't what matters. It's an ideological position of the Republic of the United States that's grounded in the reality that the God of nature has indwelt in us a strive for individualism, not because we're all supposed to be running around doing our own thing, but because we're responsible for who we are individually. That's what God has built into us, is a responsibility for self. And then we answer to him in that individualism. If you allow yourself to be sucked into this current malaise, this illness that is sweeping across our country, you're going to miss out on the blessings and the benefit of what it means to be, one, a child of God, and two, to live in the greatest republic that God has ever seen fit to grace the earth with. And you're setting yourself up as his enemy. And you just don't want to be in that position. You don't want to be in that position. Walter, once again, thank you very much for coming on. I think this is going to help people, because there's a lot of people who are feeling beat down out there. And to my friends and family and I don't even know, like, is it okay to say fans? I don't know if that's even right anymore. To my I don't want followers. That's dangerous.
Your allies.
To my allies, yes. I'm like, be an ally. To everybody who watches, as I end 98% of my videos, don't worry about being safe. Don't worry about being free from threat.
Right.
Spend your time fighting for liberty and fighting for true justice, and fight for those things and hold on to them, because it doesn't just matter for you, it matters for your children and your children's children going forward. Until next time, sic semper tyrannis.